It was a bright spring morning on May 24, 2004, in the quiet college town of Corvallis, Oregon. 19-year-old Brooke Wilberger had returned home after completing her first year at Brigham Young University, eager to spend time with her family. That morning, she headed to the Oak Park Apartments, owned by her sister and brother-in-law, to help clean and prepare for new tenants. The complex was small, surrounded by leafy trees, and nestled in a neighborhood where residents left their doors unlocked and strangers were rare. Brooke wore a light blue hoodie, faded jeans, and white flip-flops, an outfit that would later be described over and over by law enforcement, witnesses, and news anchors. She was the picture of youthful innocence. Blonde hair tied back in a ponytail, blue eyes shining, a bright smile that reflected the calm of her town. At 10:30 a.m., she was seen outside the apartment complex, standing near a lamppost and cleaning fixtures. By 11 a.m., she had vanished without a trace. Her flip-flops lay abandoned on the pavement, the cleaning bucket tipped over, water seeping slowly into the concrete, as if time itself had been interrupted. Within hours, panic spread. Brooke's family reported her missing, and police arrived, instantly sensing that this was no ordinary runaway case. The area was combed by volunteers, K-9 units, and helicopters. Neighbors recounted seeing a suspicious green van parked near the apartments earlier that morning, but no one had noted the license plate. The town, once a serene college community, was suddenly drenched in fear. People locked their doors, parents clutched their children tightly, and rumors began to swirl like wildfire. The realization hit hard. A young woman had been abducted in broad daylight from a public place, and the predator had vanished as quickly as Brooke had. This was the beginning of one of the most chilling investigations in Oregon's history. A case that would expose the mind of a remorseless killer hiding in plain sight. Within the first 48 hours, the disappearance of Brooke Wilberger became the single most urgent case in Oregon. Detectives from the Corvallis Police Department quickly recognized the signs of a targeted abduction rather than a random runaway. Brooke was deeply religious, close to her family, had no history of rebellion, and was last seen performing a mundane chore in broad daylight. That combination, a safe neighborhood, a routine task, and a sudden disappearance, set off alarms in the minds of seasoned investigators. The police set up a command center near the Oak Park Apartments, turning the normally quiet parking lot into a hub of activity. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the area where Brooke's flip-flops and cleaning bucket had been found. Officers meticulously collected evidence. Fibers, fingerprints, any possible signs of struggle. Volunteers from the community showed up in droves. Neighbors, church members, college students, even strangers, all combing through fields, wooded areas, and back roads in a desperate attempt to find the young woman. Helicopters buzzed overhead, broadcasting thermal images to searchers below. The media descended on Corvallis like a storm, amplifying the sense of urgency with 24-hour coverage. News anchors repeated the same chilling details. 19-year-old Brooke Wilberger has disappeared without a trace. Every hour, new leads came in. A van sighted near the apartments, a man seen loitering in the area, a possible scream heard in the distance. But for every lead followed, detectives ran into dead ends. Time was ticking, and the first 72 hours were crucial. The window in which most abduction victims are either rescued or lost forever. Brooke's family held press conferences, pleading tearfully for her safe return. Her mother's voice cracked as she spoke into the microphones. "Please, whoever has Brooke, let her come home." Across the town, fear morphed into paranoia. Women refused to walk alone. Parents escorted their daughters to classes. Detectives began to suspect that this wasn't a random crime. It had the markings of someone who had watched Brooke, planned the abduction, and executed it with chilling precision. FBI profilers were called in, sketching out a psychological portrait of the likely suspect. Male, mid-20s to 40s, likely local or familiar with the area, and someone who had experience controlling victims quickly. Every day that passed without a breakthrough made the air heavier, the hope thinner. Behind closed doors, detectives admitted something chilling. This predator had struck boldly, in daylight, and left nothing behind. Whoever had taken Brooke was calculating, and dangerous. As days turned into weeks, the investigation into Brooke Wilberger's disappearance intensified. Detectives were running on caffeine and instinct, following every possible lead. Then, a crucial tip came from a woman who had been driving through the area on the morning Brooke vanished. She recalled seeing a green minivan, slightly rusted, parked oddly near the Oak Park Apartments. The driver had caught her eye, a man in his 30s, with a shaved head, dark eyes, and a look that she described as cold, like he was waiting for something. Investigators immediately cross-referenced all registered green minivans in the surrounding counties. Among the names that popped up was Joel Courtney, a drifter with a long criminal history, including violent offenses and sexual assault. At the time of Brooke's disappearance, Courtney was living between Oregon and New Mexico, often disappearing for weeks. His van matched the witness's description almost perfectly. Detectives began digging deeper. They discovered that Courtney had been in Corvallis visiting relatives just days before Brooke vanished. His history painted a terrifying picture. A man capable of sudden, brutal violence and skilled at avoiding capture. But investigators didn't have enough evidence to charge him yet, so they quietly placed him under surveillance, hoping he would slip up. Meanwhile, FBI profilers continued to develop the psychological profile of the abductor, and every detail they produced seemed to fit Courtney like a glove. He was intelligent but impulsive, opportunistic but methodical, the kind of predator who could wait patiently for the perfect moment to strike. Detectives began to piece together a disturbing timeline. Courtney had likely been watching Brooke that morning as she worked outside. He waited until she was alone, then approached swiftly, possibly threatening her with a weapon or using sheer force to overpower her. The presence of her abandoned flip-flops and bucket suggested she hadn't run. She'd been taken so fast, she didn't even have time to scream. Investigators also noted Courtney's history of abductions using vehicles. He would lure or grab victims, force them into his van, and drive away before anyone could react. This chilling pattern mirrored Brooke's disappearance almost exactly. But despite this promising lead, the case remained frustratingly without hard evidence. Courtney had already left Oregon, and physical evidence linking him to the scene was scarce. For the Wilberger family, each day without answers was torture. Brooke's smiling face was on every news broadcast, every missing person poster, every storefront. The town felt haunted by her absence. Detectives knew they were circling their suspect, but catching him would require patience, precision, and a bit of luck. Behind the scenes, they began to prepare for a national manhunt, because they believed they weren't just looking for Brooke's abductor. They were tracking a predator who could strike again at any moment. By mid-summer 2004, nearly 2 months after Brooke Wilberger's disappearance, the investigation took on a national scale. Detectives had zeroed in on Joel Courtney as their prime suspect, but he had vanished, just like Brooke. His green minivan was nowhere to be found, and he'd left no forwarding address. It was as if he had evaporated into the cracks of America's interstate highways. What law enforcement didn't know at first was that Courtney had fled to New Mexico, returning to his old hunting grounds. On November 29, 2004, months after Brooke's abduction, an urgent call came through from Albuquerque police. A young college student had been kidnapped at knife point while leaving a party near the University of New Mexico. The attacker had dragged her into his van, driven her to a remote area, and brutally assaulted her, but she managed to escape, running barefoot through the darkness until she found help. When police caught the suspect, they couldn't believe it. It was Joel Courtney. His arrest sent shockwaves back to Oregon. Detectives who had spent months chasing shadows finally had their man in custody. The New Mexico case gave investigators exactly what they needed: DNA, fingerprints, and a living survivor who could describe her attacker in horrifying detail. The description matched the witness statements from Corvallis with eerie precision. Same van, same cold eyes, same method. Courtney was now behind bars in New Mexico on charges of kidnapping, sexual assault, and attempted murder. Oregon detectives immediately flew down to interrogate him, but Courtney remained calm, almost smug. He denied any involvement in Brooke's disappearance, often giving cryptic answers that led nowhere. "You can think what you want," he told investigators, leaning back in his chair. "But you've got nothing." And he wasn't entirely wrong. While the circumstantial evidence against him was mounting, there was still no physical proof tying him to Brooke. No body, no crime scene, no eyewitness to the abduction itself. But investigators weren't giving up. They began building a case brick by brick, hoping to keep Courtney locked up long enough to find the missing piece. Meanwhile, the Wilberger family followed every development with a mix of hope and agony. The man they believed had taken their daughter was finally caught, but Brooke was still missing. The quiet town of Corvallis held its breath. Detectives knew that this arrest could be their turning point. If they could link Courtney definitively to Brooke, they would not only solve the case but bring justice to a family living in unbearable limbo. Behind the scenes, Oregon prosecutors coordinated with New Mexico authorities to ensure Courtney would face both state and federal charges. The manhunt had ended, but the real battle was just beginning, proving what Joel Courtney had done to Brooke Wilberger. With Joel Courtney finally in custody in New Mexico, Oregon detectives knew they had one chance to break him. They flew to Albuquerque to conduct what would become one of the most intense interrogations of their careers. Courtney entered the interview room in shackles, wearing an orange jumpsuit. He was calm, collected, even slightly amused, as if he enjoyed watching the detectives struggle. Over the next several days, investigators applied every technique in the book. They confronted him with his criminal past, the similarities between Brooke Wilberger's disappearance and the Albuquerque attack, and the growing stack of witness statements that placed him in Corvallis at the exact time she vanished. Courtney deflected everything with cold precision. "You've got no body," he would repeat with a faint smirk. "No body, no crime." His refusal to cooperate frustrated investigators, but it also revealed something important. He enjoyed the control. He liked being the one who held the secrets. So, detectives changed their strategy. They stopped trying to break him with evidence and instead focused on psychological pressure. They let him sit in silence, sometimes for hours. They subtly mentioned Brooke's name, her family, her mother's public pleas. They left pictures of Brooke on the table, so that every time he looked up, her face stared back at him. Slowly, cracks began to appear. He became agitated when detectives mentioned the possibility of other women coming forward. He tensed up when they talked about DNA evidence, even though they didn't yet have physical proof linking him to Brooke. Meanwhile, Oregon prosecutors were quietly preparing their legal strategy. They knew Courtney was already facing decades behind bars for the New Mexico attack, but they wanted him tried in Oregon for Brooke's murder. The challenge, without a body, securing a murder conviction would be extremely difficult. Still, they pressed on, convinced that time and pressure would eventually make Courtney slip. In court hearings, he was arrogant and dismissive, often staring down Brooke's family with a chilling, emotionless expression. The media covered every development, portraying him as a calculating predator who thought he was smarter than the system. Brooke's family sat through each hearing, clutching each other's hands, their faces a mix of heartbreak and determination. Investigators began reanalyzing old evidence, sending fibers, hair, and soil samples for new forensic testing using more advanced methods. Even the smallest clue could tip the scales. Then, a breakthrough. Fibers found in Courtney's van matched those from the carpet at the Oak Park apartments where Brooke had disappeared. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was a crucial connection, enough to keep the case alive. As the courtroom drama unfolded, detectives worked tirelessly behind the scenes, knowing that the real goal wasn't just a conviction, it was finding Brooke. Courtney held the key to that, and they were determined to make him talk. Every word, every glance, every micro-expression was analyzed. What they were up against wasn't just a criminal. It was a man who thrived on control, and he wasn't going to give up his secrets easily. 4 years, Brooke Wilberger's case hovered in a painful limbo. Joel Courtney was serving time in New Mexico for the brutal kidnapping and assault of another young woman. But in Oregon, prosecutors and detectives were still locked in a battle of patience. They knew Courtney was their man, but without Brooke's body or a direct confession, a murder trial would be a high-stakes gamble. By 2008, nearly 4 years after Brooke vanished, a new strategy began to take shape. Oregon prosecutors, working with the FBI and defense attorneys, approached Courtney with a plea deal that would change everything. If he revealed the location of Brooke's body and gave a full confession, they would take the death penalty off the table and instead sentence him to life in prison without parole. It was a calculated move, not to offer leniency, but to force control out of Courtney's hands. For the first time, the power dynamic shifted. He could no longer play his cat-and-mouse game forever. Courtney initially resisted, scoffing at the idea of making a deal. But as months passed, he began to realize that the weight of evidence, combined with his inevitable aging behind bars, left him with little leverage. His attorney quietly urged him to consider the offer. Investigators also understood something crucial. Joel Courtney wasn't going to confess out of guilt or remorse. He would only talk if it served his ego. So they tailored their approach accordingly. No accusations, no moral appeals. Instead, they framed the deal as a way for him to tell his story on his own terms. That got his attention. In April 2009, inside a sterile courtroom, Joel Courtney finally stood before a judge and confessed to abducting and murdering Brooke Wilberger.